Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Tom Garcia. I'm going to be a co-presenter on this webcast entitled Arrhythmia Recognition, the Art of Education. Okay, the objectives for this section include the concept of art and science, not art versus science. And we'll get into that discussion in a few minutes. We're also going to talk about teacher versus educator. There's a difference between the two, and we want to make sure that people understand what they are. Then we're going to take a look at vector electrocardiography, which is an old system for interpreting electrocardiography, but has a tremendous amount of information which we can glean some interpretive value from. And then last, we're going to take a look at the need for simplicity, both in our education and in the tools that we use. A lot of people ask me why I have the words, the art of interpretation, all over my books. Well, mostly it's because medicine is a science and it's an art. In order to make it easier to express these concepts, I like to start off by examining the symbol of the yin and yang. When we look at that symbol, you have a circle, and basically inside the circle are two swirling globs of colorful mass that are swirling around each other. Okay, it's a perpetual two-dimensional dance where these things are constantly filling all the squares, and they're changing shape because it's in a constant state of flux. But notice that they only occupy the same limited amount of space. You can never have more of one than the other. And also notice a very important thing, that each one of them contains a little bit of the other inside it. Inside the sea of blue is a little gray dot. Inside the sea of gray is a little blue dot. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, it means that neither one of them is dominant, neither one of them is submissive, and each has a spark of the other within its own being, okay? The yin and the yang represents competing forces in the universe. It talks about good, evil, light, dark, science, religion, and the oppositional nature that we have attached to the concepts of art and science. So, when we look at this, there's no good thing, there's no bad thing. They both have their own purposes. Everything is important. The universe has to be in balance. Okay, so to sit there and say science is a correct answer is wrong. To sit there and say art is a correct answer is wrong. It's a combination of the two that we really need to try to strive for. So, science has slowly creeped in and started taking over our basic understanding and dominating our daily lives. Okay, that's because science is becoming much more aggressive. We're getting tremendous amounts of information, and we're concentrating on those bits of information. Science looks at hard data. It's measurable, verifiable, reproducible. It's really fantastic, but you have to be a rational thinker. You have to think about the fact that you are not covering every base. If you think that we're covering every little bit of data that we have available out there, and if you think we're covering every topic, every confounding variable, I have news for you. You're wrong. Okay? It just doesn't happen. To argue that science or religion is superior is as futile as having a discussion about quantum physics with an ant. The strength of science is we ponder why things occur, why we apply logic to our theories. As long as science takes into account the confounding variables and subtleties of these existences, then we get across some fairly indisputable information. However, medicine hasn't reached that point yet. We haven't achieved those lofty goals. Money for research goes into the subject that will provide the best return on your investment. So, EKGs is becoming a dying art, which is the problem that we're having now. Okay, mostly because we got really cool stuff that we can actually start doing. We can do cardiac caths, we can do echoes, we can do spec studies, we can do a bunch of other stuff. But for a bedside test that provides instantaneous possibilities to a clinician for less than 10 cents, okay, and is right there available to you right at the patient's bedside, is really difficult to beat. Studies that take ECG interpretations into the research realm forget one very important thing. ECGs are not meant to be read in a vacuum. They're not supposed to be read just as a strip. For example, I'm just bringing this off the top of my head, but suppose you take a look at the variables and the criteria for hypertension. Well, not every one of them is going to be 100%. There are certain sensitivities and specificities that we have as a trade-off to what's there on the EKG. Now, does it really matter? Yes, it does. When you look at an EKG by itself, Can you interpret it and say that sign is 100% sensitive and 100% specific? No, you can't. But that's not the issue. The issue is when you have an EKG, it's suggestive of hypertension, and you put it together with the patient's history, physical examination, laboratory data. You talk to the family members. You get the background of what's going on with that guy. And then you put it all together. Then all of a sudden your sensitivity does go up much higher. And your specificity goes up higher as well. So all that being said, it's not a bad test. It's just gotten a bad rap. And I don't want you to ever forget that because it's really important. When it comes to rhythm disorders, I don't think there's a better test around because you put the person on a monitor and you can see immediately what they're doing. It's just the interpretation of that data that's really important. And that's why you have to learn the mechanisms of why they occur. All right. So is that we are that little dot of gray that's swimming in a sea of blue, okay? We have the art form inside the science as well as the science inside the art form. All right? Don't ever lose that concept and try to inspire your students to understand the fact that everything in medicine is not black and white. There's a heck of a lot of gray issues right there. Education, on the other hand, is an art form. People can start talking about this as a science and they can start doing this. And yeah, the concepts of adult education are written down and have been verifiably shown to be a positive effect. But if it was a straight system, a linear system of information, everybody would follow the same protocols. Everybody would be a great teacher. Everybody on the planet would have the same identical way of doing this. But it's what makes the teacher different. That little human quality is that perception that we're trying to go for, especially in this particular lecture series. Okay, the man that's personified this to me more than anybody else is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was one of the most brilliant people that ever existed on the face of the earth. He was an artist, and he was a scientist. He was an engineer. He was an anatomist. He was the most unbelievable all-around mind that I've ever heard of or ever read about in my entire life. He understood the need for harmony and balance in our everyday life. That's why he's on the cover of all my books, because it reminds me, and it should remind you, of what we're actually trying to get. My philosophy in education is you can learn from anybody. I'm just proposing a different way to get this information across to you and to get it across to your students. This has been a long introduction, and believe me, we promise things are going to pick up, as I mentioned before. We only ask you to keep your mind open, exchange some ideas, and for the sake of improving your students and yourself, give it a shot. All right, now let's move on. What exactly is a teacher? Well, I think we all know what a teacher is, so I'm going to try to skip that definition since I've spent so much time on the previous information. But I've met a heck of a lot of teachers. They've all been dedicated, hardworking individuals. They follow usually a roadmap that's set down by societies or by the school boards in order to teach our students. They go over some information, they give us assignments, they give us and collect homework, they give us tests, and they give us grades. Now, teachers base their principles on the Darwin's principles of survival of the fittest. Okay? Originally, teachers said, this is what it is. I'm going to teach you this topic. If you didn't do it right, if you didn't learn from it, you know what? Pick another topic. Pick another field. That's not a bad way to go about it. Today's day and age, everybody has to pass. Everybody has to move on. Everybody has to get ahead because we all have to have little gold stars after our name. But the reality is, it's a brutal fact, but not everybody is intended to be in medicine. Not everybody is intended to be a clinician. And it's better to find out early and find another niche that you belong in, or that to find out late and having spent 20 years to get a career and, $500,000 in some cases of physicians in order to find out that you really stink at this. Okay? So discipline is important to them. And discipline is something I strongly support when it comes to getting the information across to students. They have to have the discipline, both from you as an educator to demand certain things from them, and also from themselves. They have to have the internal discipline to try to find out the answers for themselves. You can only be, as the words of the great Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon said, you can only be like a finger pointing towards the moon. You cannot concentrate on the finger because then you will miss all the heavenly glory. Okay, and it's true. You are there to point them out. You are there to point them in the right direction. If they don't follow that direction, that's their choice. Okay, but how we point that direction makes a big difference. And that's what we're hoping to talk about in this particular webcast. Is this a way to approach education? Well, the way to approach it is to actually become educators. And we'll talk about that in a second. Now, people in general love to know about who their presenters are, and they love to hear little stories about their presenters. I watch the Food Channel all the time, and they constantly say, oh, well, you got to tell little anecdotes about yourself and your life. So guess what? I'm going to give you an anecdote now. All right? It satisfies your curiosity and it keeps you awake, because I really want to keep you awake during most of this. Well, I'm going to start off by showing you a picture of my third grade class. Now, if you're an old geezer like me, you can remember that usually the most intelligent students get seated up front. And they usually want to sit up front because they're a bunch of nerds. Okay? Just like I used to be. So, taking a look at this picture, can you find out who I am? Okay? I'll give you a couple of seconds to try to figure that out. By the way, I do not wear a bow tie and I do not wear a dress. Okay? No, that's actually not me. The other little third guy in the front row is definitely not me. I'm the little chubby guy back there in the back who's got that unbelievably amazed look and just seeking to find out more information. Here, I'll give you a little closer look at it. Yeah, I was completely bored about this picture process, and it was obvious in my face. But actually, what they did in my class, which is interesting, was Miss Barbara, who was my one of the loves of my life, was my third grade teacher, and she used to sit everybody according to height because she didn't want the really tall guys to block the little short guys in the back. So that's the reason I'm sitting all the way in the back. But trust me, I was a teacher's pet. Now, here representing Miss Barbara is a picture of my wife. She actually is my actual wife, but you know, she's a great woman. She actually allowed me to Photoshop her head onto the body of a nun for this. And she actually didn't give me a lot of grief about it, but I know I will be paying that price for a long time. Anyway, what a woman. Now, my third grade education was fantastic. My fourth grade was very good as well. But as I started going on, I started realizing that discipline became a bigger part of parochial education because nuns loved to make sure that discipline was carried out. And they were very tough taskmasters. I saw everybody get beat from anything from a cat o' nine tails, believe it or not, to garden hoses and definitely paddles. And then my least favorite of all of those, because I actually never got hit by a cat o' nine tail, was the paddle with the little holes in it to make the air circulate faster and to give it less resistance so they could actually get a better swing on your butt. So this was an interesting time in education. But you know what? It does discipline you, and it does get you to focus on what you need to do, to say the least. Now, a lot of my friends really didn't do well in that system. They considered it a prison. They considered the discipline to be corporal punishment, which it was. And they came out of there a little bit more skewed than I did. I, on the other hand, and this is me, by the way, survived my trials and tribulations, and I became a well-adjusted individual, self-actualized and hungry to influence young minds as time went on. You know, so, by the way, just as a side point, just like I photoshopped my wife's picture on that nun, I just photoshopped my picture on Frank Zane's body, and because he was always my Mr. Olympia star. My son, on the other hand, didn't do as well. My son, because he started seeing all these pictures of me in little spandex and my wife in nun's outfits and paddles, started getting all these like little psychotic images that caused him to have PTSD. And he actually did the unthinkable, which is that he actually read an ECG by straight pattern recognition. Yes, my son did read an EKG by pattern recognition. And that's why now he's going to be doing a lot of time in a chain gang near you. And for the next for the next few years, he's going to be reinforcing the fact that that's a no-no in my eyes. Okay, once again, I did a little Photoshop magic there, but I wanted you guys to get a little impression about who you're dealing with and the family you're dealing with, and my level of psychosis is kind of high. All right, now, going back to discipline, since my son is in the chain gang outfit there, one of the basic tenets of adult education is that a student has to derive intrinsic value in order to make a concept their own. They actually have to feel like what they're learning is something they're going to be able to use in their daily lives. Okay, if you give them esoteric concepts, if you give them stuff that's too advanced, if you give them stuff that, they're going to see once every 500 years, they really don't care about that stuff as much. You need to point out the major things that you see, but that doesn't include just the simple stuff. It includes the stuff, if they're at a beginner or an intermediary level, then the intermediary stuff. That means combinations of pathology on an electrocardiogram. You really have to get into those. You can't just simply teach them what the simple ones are, because then when you approach them with a more complicated strip, they're going to go completely insane. So who's responsible for doing adult education? Is it the student? Is it you? Who's responsible for promoting that level of understanding? How do you show someone who doesn't have any real experience in the field how valuable of a tool and these strips and the recognition of these strips and of ECGs are important to them? Who's the one that has to capture their imagination and broaden their horizons? And who, once you've lifted the veil from their minds, needs to be there to guide them to a deeper understanding? Well, that burden of responsibility falls on you. Qui docet discit, please pardon my Latin pronunciation, states, he who teaches learns. I learned this lesson really quickly during my medical career when I was in residency, because our main point of emphasis was you see one, you do one, you teach one. It was clear that teaching allowed you to master your trade, and that's because you have to actually spend time to think about what you're doing and how you're doing it. We reinforce these skills by our ability to communicate. We reinforce it by trying to teach somebody else and have them go through their hurdles while you're trying to help them do it. By teaching, we ourselves evolve. Now, when I ask you to think back on your life and I ask you to think about who's the one that influenced your life the most, chances are most of you will say that the person who expanded your mind the most and your horizons and your soul was a teacher. Those are the special teachers who taught you and incorporated life's lessons into simplicity. They let you understand that the lesson has to be with you forever, and it's something that nobody could take from you. They're the ones who believed in you, knew your potential, and selflessly worked with you to reach that enlightenment. Okay, those teachers are exceptional. I refer to this elite class of people as educators. I want all of you guys to be educators, not teachers. Educators free your mind to examine all the possibilities. They let you see each of the twinkling lights as their own separate galaxies. And just as easily as they took you to the maximum level, they can bring you back to Earth to see reality and the real purpose of this world. We all need to know our purpose, educators and students alike. It is not fame or glory. It is rage. It is a rage against the dying of the light. And you, my Father, there on a sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Pain, suffering, and death are our enemies. Humility is our armor. Knowledge and wisdom are our shields, and therapeutic intervention is our sword. In arrhythmia recognition, our battle plan is to understand our enemy. We need to understand that enemy completely if we want to defeat it. We need to understand the bioelectricity of the heart. Now, I want to turn our attention to Dr. Willis Hurst. Dr. Hurst was a man that I knew and I absolutely respected as a clinician and as an educator. Dr. Hurst was a pioneer in cardiology and in medical education. He's authored a bunch of books, including one of his most famous, which is Hurst, the Heart, which is a classic reference textbook in cardiology. It's one of the two biggies between that and Eugene Braunwald. He's also one of the greatest electrocardiographers that I've ever met and was able to reach heights that really were amazing to watch. One day we were at a conference and they were giving him unknowns. And all of a sudden they presented an unknown. And he goes, well, this is a patient who's got tachycardia about 120. They have this. And can I ask you guys a question? Why was it? How did you guys get the monkey to stand still to get an EKG done? He opened my eyes to the need to understand strips and interpret the vectors of those strips on paper. Bioelectricity causes vectors, okay? And those vectors are where we actually interpret on a rhythm strip. We're interpreting the graphical representation of those vectors on a strip as it's moving through the machine. If you understand the vectors, you understand pathology. Now, we have to take that with a grain of salt because most people really do not understand the vectors, but yet we can interpret electrocardiography. And that's because you do it by pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is an excellent way of doing it. Don't get me wrong, and I'm sorry my son has to spend so much time in prison doing that. But the reality is, it is not the total answer. We need to go a little bit deeper than just looking at the pattern that the ECG actually demonstrates to us. I once heard that seeing the tree through the forest was the definition of genius. This guy could see the trees. He really could. Let's take a look at how he did it. Typically, we're pattern recognition people by nature. When we look at this EKG, we see, I can't really tell the rate because you can only have one little complex, but it does have a left axis deviation, it has a left anterior hemming block. There's a slurred S wave in 1 and V6, and an R prime complex in V1. The QRS complex is 0.12, which is compatible with the right bundle branch block. And there's slight ST elevation in 2-3 and AVF with minimal depression in AVL. Whenever you have even a slight amount of elevation in 2-3 and AVF, and then some minimal depression in AVL, or vice versa, you have to take a look at it seriously because those appear to be reciprocal changes. And reciprocal changes are actually some of the first things you actually see in an acute MI. So keep that in mind. Don't just blow it off because it's less than 1 millimeter. Remember, the 1 millimeter and the 2 millimeter marks that we talk about in the criteria are to give thrombolytics. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not having an AMI. And you could take that person to the cath lab and do some balloon angioplasty or whatever you have to do to get rid of it. So always be very suspicious whenever you see that combination. Okay, in addition with that, I always say that if you have an inferior infarct, only old inferior infarcts show up by themselves in 2-3 and AVF. If it's in 2-3 and AVF, look somewhere else because there's probably some other complex involved. Well, if we look at 3 and 2, and I know this is going beyond the spectrum of arrhythmia recognition, but if you notice, lead 3 has a little bit more elevation than lead 2, which is suggestive of a right ventricular infarct. So whenever I have an inferior infarct, I always take 2 extra leads. I take the posterior leads and I take the right-sided leads. Now, always remember, they don't usually occur on their own when they're in inferior leads. They're usually associated with somebody else. That's a pretty good interpretation of this EKG. That's pattern recognition. You get a lot of information from it. But notice that I had to get a bunch of extra leads in order to really prove this conclusively. Dr. Hurst, actually in his book Ventricular Electrocardiography, went into how he got that information. And the way he does it is he takes a look at vectors. And this man can pop up with all these little vectors within a few seconds of looking at an EKG because he's done it most of his life and he's done it so many thousands of times that he just was able to do it almost spontaneously. But when he looked at it, he noticed that the first initial 0.04 seconds was directed leftward, okay, and slightly forward. That slight forward is what triggered him off to the posterior wall infarct. The QRS complex is also slight up and slightly forward, which is suggestive of infraposterior wall damage involved in an acute myocardial infarction. Another thing that triggered him off to this and told him that it was basically an acute ongoing process and not a chronic process or secondary electrolyte abnormalities is the fact that the ST and T wave vectors are in opposite directions, which is suggestive of an acute myocardial infarction or an acute ischemia injury pattern that's occurring right as we speak. So by vector analysis, he was able to look at the pathology of the heart and understand where exactly it was. It's a lot of information that he derives from these little vectors, but that same little pathology, he can derive amazing amounts of information from the electrocardiogram. And it's something that we should all try to strive to comprehend. Now, you're not going to get to this point unless you really spend a lot of years in discipline in this, but what I want you to understand is the EKG is a representation of the pathology of the heart. Okay? Waves are like fingerprints. Everybody has them different. So when we look at an EKG and you learn by pattern recognition, you're going to remember that fingerprint and say, this fingerprint doesn't match this particular pathology. But the reality is we all have different fingerprints. So it's the patterns of those vectors that he looks at. We kind of look at the pattern of the EKG graph and the tracing in order to come up with our answers. Which one's more effective? Well, I think he kind of proved it, but it's going to be difficult to keep that going in a lot of cases for us because we don't have that kind of capability and that kind of insight into them. So this is a fantastic system. It's a system that really gets a lot of information across. Now, think of the possibilities. All right. If this was such a great system, if the Grant's method of electrocardiographic analysis was such a grand system, why did it die out? Okay. Well, the main reason is because nobody championed it. Educators didn't champion it. It was too difficult. So basically they let it go by the wayside. And then they started looking at other little toys to try to come up with the same information. And the other toys are the cardiac cath and the echoes and all the other stuff we talked about earlier. Similar concepts occurred in cosmology. When we looked at cosmology, it was foreign ideas to most people. We understood these concepts only because people like Carl Sagan, Stephen Hawking, all these people started talking to us about it and translated their mathematical language into normal language so we could actually look at. They look at the math and they see the images. We look at the math and see a bunch of funny letters and symbols. If the Grant method had a Carl Sagan, we'd all be doing electrocardiography by the same system, but we don't. Okay? Those concepts are lost because nobody could explain them. They couldn't get the graphics and they couldn't get the illustrations to really champion their cause. That's what we're trying to do here. And we're trying to get those things so that we can pass them on to our students. So the little bit of information we're going to get, we should try to pass on because otherwise it dies. And right now, electrocardiography is dying out. We need to do something about it. In 2011, Dr. Hurst died, and it was a big hit to the medical community. It left us with a big hole that I don't think will ever be replaced, and that's that interpretation of the Grant's concept. Imagine what would have happened if Albert Einstein died without being able to pass on the theory of relativity to the rest of us. But through me and through a bunch of other people who dealt with him, the concept of looking further into an electrocardiogram and being able to decipher that information is going to be extremely important. It doesn't really pertain to arrhythmia recognition, but the concepts are the same. Well, another section's come to a close, and we really appreciate your participation in this series. As always, we're going to give you the information to contact us directly, and we'll get back to you with a personalized answer as soon as possible. Thanks a lot.